I want to take a little socialist side quest for a second. Mark Carney was accused throughout this campaign by a lot of conservatives of being a kind of a communist or a socialist, which kind of at first blush is a pretty crazy accusation. As someone who is a kind of lifelong banker, and especially an alumni of Goldman Sachs, which is the kind of blood sport of capitalism, I'd say he's about as far from a socialist as you can get. However, because he does have kind of a bigger view of the economy and understands kind of the labor force and economy within kind of a bigger context of what it means in terms of the social contract, I think he does have some mental flexibility to think about how the economy works and how the different parts of the economy have to work so that everyone has a fair shake at things. Now, here is why this is important. I have said it before, and I want to emphasize it based on kind of a few developments this week, that AI, automation, and robotics are going to fundamentally change the conversation that we need to have about how we run our country, how we run our economy, and how we share wealth. Now, kind of at any time through history that we have kind of dabbled in socialism and communism, it has not gone terribly well for the most part. I think there's probably a number of people who would debate that pretty fiercely, but bear with me on that. And I think that is part of the reason why it has almost become the kind of like easy insult word in these kind of political arguments. Is that's almost like the ultimate insult of a leftist is to say, oh, they're just a communist or they're just a socialist. But given what is happening in AI and robotics, I think it is time that we do have to think about some of these concepts in a very uncomfortable way. And let's kind of talk about just very roughly what we are talking about when we talk about socialism and communism. Communism is the kind of extreme end point of the kind of socialist spectrum, which is saying like there is no private property and kind of everyone kind of gets the amount that they need and kind of gives what they can into the system. And it's that kind of very kind of all for one for all kind of approach. Socialism is considered as being a little further back on the spectrum. So, capitalism still exists within a socialist context, which means, even though there is kind of more kind of shared control of a lot of things in society and kind of shared benefit, that there is still the kind of idea of private property. There is still kind of different wages depending on how you contribute. And here's why this is important. If you kind of go back to the very beginning, not to turn this into like a kind of history lesson or anything, but kind of capitalism at its very base has been this kind of struggle back and forth between capital and labor. And so, labor is the work that we do, and capital is the kind of stuff that we need to do the work. And the idea within capitalism is that, by investing in these things, we can improve how well we can produce stuff that makes our labor more efficient. But there's always been this tension back and forth between how much money goes back to the people who own capital and how much money goes back to the people who do the labor. And that kind of back and forth fairness has been kind of the modern kind of ping pong that we play in terms of fairness in society. Now, the reason that matters, so when we saw things like the Industrial Revolution and you started going into factories and things like that, suddenly that swung way over towards capital. That suddenly those kind of the barons owning the factories who owned capital would suddenly get like these huge rewards from the kind of products that came out of the factories. And the labor was kind of more and more just kind of, pulled away from the skill and joy of work and was getting paid less and less as a result as we brought that automation in. The reason that matters at this moment in history, I've mentioned before in terms of artificial general intelligence and so on, is that what we are seeing, and I'll kind of show a few things. There's one of the things I'll show is like this figure robot that is now kind of artificially intelligent, kind of native in the robot. That whole back and forth between labor and capital is going out the window, because when you have robots and intelligent robots, suddenly labor is capital. So whoever owns capital actually suddenly owns labor as well. There's no longer a negotiation with workers in terms of how this works. It is just human labor. It will increasingly not be necessary. And so the reason I'm kind of mentioning this now, some of the news that is coming in this week is, for example, there are now some autonomous tractor trailer kind of semi trucks that are doing regular long haul routes between Dallas and Houston. Now, in the kind of trucking world, that is a kind of not a very big distance, but those are kind of active loads that are going, and kind of that's now kind of building out that capability of driverless long haul trucking. In Canada, we have 320 plus thousand people who work in the trucking industry. So we have kind of over 300,000 truckers in this country. If this technology advances further, you can expect that significant numbers of those truckers will be out of a job. And it kind of extends beyond just things like trucking. If you go into, there's an example this week of a Chinese robot that was used in Australia, and it was able to install this kind of autonomous AI robot was able to install 10,000 solar panels in this giant solar panel array, sped up the project by 25% as a result of it being able to do that. And, that is kind of a huge jump forward, that we're actually seeing autonomous robots being able to do kind of real work in the real world, which is kind of a real threat to humans in that process. Walt Disney is going to be reanimated as a robot in Disneyland. Going to have story time with Walt Disney. And, you might have heard the news about this kind of robot marathon in China as a whole bunch of robots were running along. I'm going to also show kind of, you'll see in the background in a moment, this kind of figure robot as well. So the figure robot that they have here is doing a test case, a test run in a BMW factory as a proof of concept. But if you think of this as kind of manual labor, but skilled manual labor, that they are doing this in a factory setting, this is not a specialized setup for them. They're able to kind of step into a human-oriented assembly line. And you can see that these are workers that do not need to sleep, do not need to take vacation, don't ask for a raise. They just kind of will cycle in to charge themselves and just keep working kind of around the clock. You can see how that could very quickly become the norm. And an important thing about those figure robots is the kind of AI that they have uses observational learning. Okay, so if you think of in the factories now, where you have these giant industrial robots that need very specialized tooling, programming, and everything that's incredibly expensive to kind of optimize them to do one function super well. These robots with observational learning are intended to be able to step in like a kind of human trainee, see how things are done, and kind of mimic that kind of work so they can learn on the job like a human would. So they are being specifically designed to step into the human workplace. Which brings us back to now, brings us back to the political moment that we're in, and brings us back to this kind of joke around socialism and calling Carney a socialist. I'm going to show a clip right now. The gentleman on the right in this clip is Geoffrey Hinton, who is known as one of the godfathers of AI. So he was one of the early pioneers of artificial intelligence and kind of helping artificial intelligence make the great leaps that it has made recently. And listen to his answer to this question from the interviewer, who is kind of fretting about what will we do in society as these kinds of jobs are taken over.
Productivity gain may not be fairly distributed among citizens, and it could again simply accrue to a few owners, a few billionaires at the top. How do we make sure that these gains are properly distributed and we get out of this awful slump of stagnating living standards?
Socialism.
It's just as simple as that, is it? Where you just need proper socialist leadership?
Yep.
OK.
Did not need a lot of extra words there. He just straight up socialism. Now, easy for him to say, what would that actually look like? I think there's people like Bill Gates have suggested things like a robot tax, that, you know, all of these robots should be kind of taxed in the same kind of way that there might be kind of income taxes or something for human workers, but something that then kind of goes back into the government coffers that can be kind of used for compensation for people. You might have heard things like universal basic income, this idea that everyone gets a kind of a base layer payout. Nobody really has cracked the code on this yet. I think a lot of these kind of collective ideas of how, you know, everyone gets paid for something make us deeply uncomfortable in our culture. We have very much a culture around you get paid for the work that you do. We don't like the idea of people just sort of sitting back and taking advantage. And so there's these kind of ideas that for a lot of us are not very well formed, but we know we just don't like the idea of it. We're kind of taught from an early age that hard work is important, and that's kind of a key part of being a contributing member of society. But there's a conversation we need to start having about what does that look like when most work is starting to get replaced by these machines. I know even in my industry, I have replaced a lot of my own work using artificial intelligence in a way that has made me pretty uncomfortable. Parts that I thought I was really good at and were kind of what made me special in some way are now kind of being done better by some of the AI tools that I use. And so it's not just things like, trucking and manufacturing where you're going to see these machines and kind of technologies replacing people. You're also going to see it in kind of medical technicians, doctors, lawyers, all those kind of white collar jobs that were supposed to be the kind of safer jobs are not safer jobs. In fact, many of them are almost more easily replaced than kind of manufacturing jobs. If you think of like a construction site for a house or something like that, that highly kind of ambiguous environment is still quite difficult for these things to operate in. So in a way, they, in the short term, they're kind of safer than maybe a lot of office jobs, but it's kind of inevitable that this is the direction that we're going in. So that means, when we're kind of making fun of the politicians as being kind of a socialist or something, we should also be thinking about, okay, but what do we want these politicians to be thinking about socialism? Because if suddenly most of our work can be replaced by machines, what does that mean for how wealth is distributed? Does that just mean that whatever company owns all the robots gets all that money, and then whoever the shareholders in that are or the owners of that are get everything and the rest of us get nothing? Or does it mean that there needs to be some way of sharing that revenue that comes off of what the robots are able to produce? What does that mean for pensions? What does that mean for, levels of pay across society? What does it mean for kind of how we deliver social services? Are there jobs that we will replace and jobs that we won't? What are the kind of extents of all of these things? What jobs can we trust to them and which ones can we not? This is going to be a whole set of conversations that's not going to be kind of a single group that can figure it out. This is going to be a kind of whole of society conversation that we need to have. We need to have leaders in political power that are able to have these complex conversations and are going to be flexible, kind of philosophically, mentally flexible in how they come up with solutions to this. Because again, nobody has the answers to this. This is kind of near unprecedented in human history. A lot of time we say, oh, well, when the printing press came out, some of those jobs shifted over here. When the cotton gin and kind of manufacturing came out, we just shifted jobs. People learned to do new things. But what we're talking about is machines that are able to kind of physically and cognitively do anything that we can do as well or better. And so potentially there aren't those kind of easy things that we can shift into. And so we need to have a kind of adult conversation about what that looks like. So next time you're thinking that Carney's a socialist, maybe you can look at it again and say, well, I sure hope he is.